From the towering Wasatch Mountains of the American Southwest, we welcome you to this episode of Undiscovered Utah. This show focuses on the mysteries that surround the rugged, difficult, and sometimes deadly American Southwest. I'm your host, JB, and tonight I'm going to share with you the story of the lost golden Jesus statue that is said to be right here in Utah. I know what some of you are thinking. Golden Jesus statue? It's not lost. It's on top of most Mormon temples. Well, that's not the statue of Jesus. That's a statue of the angel Moroni, and you can track down a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to tell you that story if you feel so inclined. So what is the story of the lost golden Jesus statue? This story starts long ago, so find a comfy spot to sit and a yummy treat to snack on, and let's get started. It is a well-known fact that Columbus arrived in the Americas in 1492. In the year 1519, Hernan Cortez left Cuba to conquer the mainland of what is today Mexico. His first objective was to overthrow the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. This took a few years to accomplish, but in 1521, the capital had fallen to the Spanish. After this Spanish triumph, the Spanish colonization of the Americas kicked into high gear. Precious metals like gold and silver were abundant in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs didn't use gold and silver as money. For the Aztec people, it didn't hold any value for survival, but it was beautiful, and so they used the metals to adorn their most important buildings and holy places like their temples, and also to adorn themselves. It was a pleasant surprise for the Spanish and quickly became the number one goal to seize the treasure. But the Spanish didn't want to just seize the treasures in Tenochtitlan. They wanted to find the source. Where was all of this precious metal coming from? Where were the quote-unquote Indians mining it? It didn't take the Spanish long to track down the mineral-rich mountains of the American Southwest. From modern-day New Mexico to California and everything in between, the area that the Cree Indians called Assinwati, which literally means the Rocky Mountains. These mountains were a treasure trove of riches. The Spanish quickly enslaved the indigenous people of the Southwest through a process called conversion. Here is how that worked. The King of Spain, by royal order, had commanded that each real of mines had to have a church nearby. So, once the Spanish would discover the location of the indigenous people's mines, they would send a priest with an escort of Spanish soldiers. The priest would become the owner of the newly discovered mines. As such, the priest was required by the order of the King of Spain to build a church. The more mines in a geographical location usually meant the nicer the church that would be built. However, many were no more than a simple hut or cabin. The Spanish priests quickly realized that by displaying a picture on the outside of the church, the indigenous people's curiosity would pique, as they had never seen a painting or a picture that wasn't permanently carved into a rock wall. Many times the priest would also display some trinkets from Spain or some pieces of fine cloth to entice the native people. The priests would teach the natives new ways to plant and water crops and how to build adobe structures that would provide better shelter than a pit house. The priests were often regarded as wise men because they had great knowledge. So, after impressing the natives, it wasn't too difficult to convince them to be baptized. Most likely, most natives never understood what the baptism was even about. After being baptized and quote-unquote converted, it was required that the new converts would labor in the priest's fields and or mines. This is when the true nature of the Jesuit priests would shine. The natives were giving nothing in return for their hours of hard labor. In fact, their living situation deteriorated quickly as their days and nights were spent serving the will of the priest and not taking care of their own family needs. This forced labor was not just imposed on the men, but also on the women and children. The King of Spain sent another order. It was that each mission must have 2 complete set of vestments for the priest and adornments for the altars. Bells and musical instruments were also required at each mission. In 1574, a man by the name of Lopez de Lavesco reported to Spain that there were an estimated to be in New Spain, which was everything south of the Rio Grande River, several thousand Indian towns with as many as 5 million inhabitants, all of which had been converted to Catholicism and were now required to pay tithing. By 1630, more than 25 missions had been established throughout New Mexico, which was everything north of the Rio Grande River, and that 60,000 Indians had been converted there. This created a situation where a less than honorable Jesuit priest could become quite wealthy. Many people assumed that all the gold and silver that was mined had to be sent back to the King of Spain. But that wasn't true. Only the king's fifth, or 20%, had to be shipped back to Spain. The mine owners got to keep the rest, and often their records were altered to reduce the required 20% tax. Even with only sending the king's fifth back to Spain, it required hundreds upon hundreds of galleons to carry the immense treasure from the shores of the New World back to Spain. It was the best interest of the priests to convert as many native people as possible to work in the rich mines of the Rocky Mountains. It didn't take long for the indigenous people to realize that this was a very bad deal. The Spanish lust for gold was insatiable. The Spanish priests would work the natives literally to death. Now, to be fair, not all the priests were evil, greedy men, but many were, and they enslaved the natives into forced labor. It was so bad that some of the native tribes would capture members of other tribes and sell them to the Spanish so that they themselves were not enslaved. Many indigenous people south of the Rio Grande and many north of the Rio Grande lost their lives at the hand of the Spanish. The story from one Jesuit priest who left the order said that, quote, at least 3 million Indians have been murdered by their Spanish masters, unquote. It was a common practice for the Spanish to brand their Indian workers that they owned. It is also said that if an Indian revolted and refused to labor for the priests, that the soldiers would capture the Indian and braid their long black hair into the hair of a tail of a horse or mule. Then they would whip the horse or mule, and the Indian would be drugged by their hair to their death. Across the state of Utah is the remnants of an old trail that was used by the Spanish to transport the King's Fifth to the galleons waiting along the Gulf Coast. This trail was so well used that you can still see ruts today in some sections. This is called the Old Spanish Trail. Mule trains weighted down with minted Spanish coins or Spanish-marked gold bars were traveling this trail for hundreds of years. The Old Spanish Trail was not an easy trail to cross, as it traversed the Colorado Plateau. There is very little water in this rugged, confusing landscape. Many of the mule trains never arrived in Santa Fe, as they disappeared somewhere along the Old Spanish Trail. The same story played out for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in the early 1800s, the indigenous people of Central America and many descendants of the original Spanish settlers wanted their independence from Spain. And on September 16, 1810, the Mexican War of Independence started. 300 years of torture, slavery, starvation, and oppression was coming to an end. In the Southwest, the indigenous people, with the help of some of the Mexicans, took up arms against the Spanish priests and their soldiers. Word of the massive revolt spread like wildfire, and the priests that were able to escape before being killed did so with every bit of treasure they could possibly carry. One of the nicer churches of the Southwest was under attack, but the priest was able to escape before the very nicely adorned church was burned to the ground. The padre of the mission had been, in fact, the mine owner and was able to acquire tremendous amount of wealth over the years. With his soldiers at his side, they loaded 20 mules with packs full of gold and silver. They fled to the land northward in an attempt to avoid the Apaches and were between them and Santa Fe. The priest, his soldiers, and 20 pack mules were in a frantic search for the Old Spanish Trail. The priest's rich mines were located somewhere near the Virgin River Gorge in northern Arizona. It is estimated that they traveled between the north rim of the Grand Canyon and the Arizona Strip. Now, don't confuse the Arizona Strip with the more famous Las Vegas Strip. They are two very different places, even though they are only about 100 miles apart as the buzzard flies. They continued to follow the northern side of the Colorado River in hopes of finding the Old Spanish Trail. This led them right into what is today the heart of southern Utah. Most likely they stayed close to the water of the Colorado River. But if you have been to this part of the country, you know that the Colorado River is not always easy to access as it winds its way through deep sandstone canyons. This must have made travel extremely slow going, and I'm fairly confident that some of the heavy laden mules died along the way. Not only is this a difficult trail to blaze carrying gold and silver, they were also being pursued by the native peoples that revolted against him. Burning the church at the mission was not enough justice to make up for hundreds of years of abuse. The mule train finally reached the southern end of what we know today as 50-Mile Mountain. The mules that were left were near death themselves. Many of the soldiers had been killed at the hands of those that pursued them. The desert that now lay between them and the old Spanish Trail is the most difficult, dry, and deadly landscape in all of North America. There was no way they could escape with their lives and the treasure. The Padre only had 2 soldiers that remained alive. The 3 men made a plan to hide the treasure and escape to the safety of Santa Fe. In time, this revolt would be put down and they could return to their cache. They found a small cave near the south end of 50-Mile Mountain. Here, they buried the gold bars, silver coins, and all the treasure from the church that they could carry. But the most prized treasure that the priest had in his possession was a 3-foot-tall, solid gold cross with a pure gold figure of the crucified Christ on it. It is said that the cross was so heavy that it took all 3 men to carry it into the cave and bury it. They hid the small cave as best they could with stones and sticks and plants, marked its location, and started the nearly impossible trek from the south end of 50-Mile Mountain to where the Colorado River meets the old Spanish Trail. Today, we call this location Moab. After the Mexican Revolution, the land once known as New Spain and New Mexico was never under Spanish rule again. New Spain became Mexico, and in time, the land north of the Rio Grande became part of the United States of America. Somewhere hidden in a small cave near the southern end of 50-Mile Mountain, or what the Paiute call the Kaparowitz, is a treasure of untold wealth still waiting to be discovered. But if you are the one to find it, remember, this is all part of the national monument. So the treasure all goes to the government. Today, this area is part of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. If you want to go explore this area, you need to travel to the small town of Escalante, Utah. This makes for a great base camp. You will need a high clearance 4x4 with good shocks, as many of the dirt roads are very washboarded. Even if you're not lucky enough to find the priceless golden Jesus statue, there are many beautiful treasures waiting to be discovered by you. This area is very rugged even today, but worth a visit. There is a dirt road that parallels 50-Mile Mountain. There is much to see and explore along this road, like Devil's Garden. Young and old alike will enjoy this sandstone playground. This road follows the trail that the pioneers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints took when they moved their families from Cedar City to Bluff, Utah. The road terminates at the famous Hole in the Rock. Along the road, you will pass other famous landmarks like Dance Hall Rock, where the pioneers stopped to rest and relax a few days before their journey continued. Also along the road are famous slot canyons like Peekaboo and Spooky. If you set up a base camp in or near the town of Escalante, you can also easily visit Calf Creek Falls, the Petrified Forest State Park, and it's only a short drive along Highway 12 to the town of Boulder, Utah, and the beautiful Burr Trail. With spring soon approaching, now is the perfect time to start planning your trip to this lesser known but incredibly beautiful part of Utah. Tonight's show is dedicated to Chance. He was kind enough to drop us an email and suggest tonight's topic. Great suggestion, Chance. Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed tonight's episode of Undiscovered Utah. If you would like more information about tonight's episode, you can email us at info@undiscoveredutah.com. You can find us on the internet at undiscoveredutah.com or on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. And be sure to follow us. Just search for Undiscovered Utah. I hope you'll join me next time as I share more about the Great Southwest. Good night, everybody.